All right, guys, we are now going to start section 8, which is about segregation and apartheid. So, we're going to start with the United States. And this section is going to focus heavily on the United States and South Africa. Now, in the United States, obviously we had slavery of black people in this country for a long time, right up until the Civil War, and that ended in 1865. And very soon after, we passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which collectively kind of outlawed slavery and said people, regardless of race, are citizens of the United States, and citizens cannot be denied due process, and et cetera, et cetera. But the post-war South, the countries that had been slave states, were really not ready to accept black people as equals. It had been so ingrained in the white population of those states especially, but the United States as a whole, that black people are lesser, they're other, they're different, they're less than, that they started passing these laws, and they became known as Jim Crow laws. And these were essentially laws requiring segregation. So, sure, black people and white people are legally entitled to the same things thanks to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, but we're still going to have, there's going to be black schools and white schools, black restaurants and white restaurants. So we're going to completely segregate out everything. So there's, black areas and white areas, and that kind of institutionalized segregation was really had a lot of ethical problems, right? In 1896, there was a famous Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson, where essentially this guy Plessy was being discriminated against. He was only 1/8 black. He had one great grandparent or whatever that was black, and so he tried to sit on the white part of a bus or a train or something. And due to these Jim Crow laws, he wasn't legally allowed to do that, and he got kind of thrown off the bus or the train. And he sued, and he said, look, these things, this separation is not okay. And the Supreme Court in 1896 said, separateness is not a violation of due process as long as they're equal. Right? So just because you're keeping people separate doesn't mean there's an unequal treatment, right? But even back then, I think most people knew that was nonsense. But it wasn't until like 60 years later that we had another Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education, where the Supreme Court came down and finally said, no, separate but equal, the whole principle from Plessy v. Ferguson, is inherently unequal, right? Just separateness, period, is unequal. You have to integrate. In this particular case was about schools. You cannot have separate black and white schools. You have to start integrating. So they started integrating the schools in 54, and this is a picture of a African American student trying to attend the school and getting kind of yelled at and having slurs shouted at her, and it was a very, very difficult time for those African American students who just, they were just trying to get an education. They were just trying to finish school, but they got harassed and bullied and, all kinds of things because this racism, again, especially in the South, but also in other parts of the country, was so ingrained in people. There was actually an instance in World War II. We had a whole bunch of soldiers in England preparing for and fighting World War II. And there was one small town in England where there were 3 bars, and the white soldiers essentially went up to these bar owners and said, "Look, we need black bars and we need white bars. I don't want to drink in the same bar as African Americans, and this race mixing is not okay." And so the 3 English owners of these bars, who had not been ingrained in this philosophy of segregation, got together and said, "Okay, all 3 bars in this city are now blacks only," and they let black American soldiers drink all they wanted, plus all the English people who wanted to come in, but no white American soldiers, because this is a blacks only bar. So that was kind of an interesting pushback against that segregationist mindset that was so common then and is even still disturbingly common today. Another major landmark was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Signed into law by LBJ, and it essentially outlawed discrimination, not just by the government, but also discrimination in housing, discrimination in apartment rentals and restaurants and voting and all these other very important things. The government finally sat down and said, "Look, you can't bar people from your restaurant just based on the color of their skin. That is not okay." But this is what it was like before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There were colored drinking fountains and swimming pools and white drinking fountains and swimming pools, and of course the nicer ones were always the white ones. This is actually a really good story. That's Marilyn Monroe and Ella Fitzgerald. And Marilyn Monroe was a huge fan of Ella Fitzgerald. But she would go to these clubs and say, "Hey, you should hire Ella Fitzgerald to come sing in your club." And the clubs would say, "No, we can't. We don't hire black performers." So Marilyn Monroe would say, "Look, I tell you what. You hire her to come sing, and I, Marilyn Monroe, will be in the front row once a week watching her sing." And these clubs knew that Marilyn Monroe being there would be a huge draw. Like, people would come from all over, not just to see Ella Fitzgerald, but also just to see Marilyn Monroe, even in the audience. So they started hiring Ella Fitzgerald to come sing in their previously segregated clubs, and Marilyn Monroe would come once a week and watch her sing. And that was kind of an interesting way to fight racism via economics, right? South Africa, similar kind of history. They were conquered by the Dutch, colonized by the Dutch, and even when they became an independent nation, it was controlled exclusively, essentially, by the European members of the country, not the African members of the country. And starting in 1910, they started this process of what's called apartheid, okay, apartness, keeping the races separate. And this became more formalized and more formalized and more formalized in law until it was incredibly overt. I would go as far as to say even more overt than the Jim Crow laws of the American South. And there were kind of 3 versions of this apartheid, or 3 areas, 3 zones. First was grand apartheid, which meant we need to separate political and institutional power by race. So whites got to vote. Whites got to run for office and hold office. Black people didn't. Black people had got no say in the political process or the institutional process. The criminal justice system, the business system, all those institutions, they were denied power. The second was urban apartheid, i.e. space. So in cities, there were black restaurants and white restaurants. There were even black sides of the street and white sides of the street, where, the different races couldn't even share a sidewalk. but there was also what land you were allowed to own, right? So all the good land was reserved for whites, where they could build houses or make, gold mines and stuff like that. The crappy land, far away, not very good for farming, not very good for much, that was the land that blacks were allowed to own. So it was a physical separation geographically. And the third one was petty apartheid, which was separateness of socialization. Okay, you weren't allowed to marry across racial lines, but you also weren't allowed to date. You weren't allowed to hold hands. You weren't even allowed to be seen together. Many of you know The Daily Show. Trevor Noah. He's a South African of mixed race who grew up in this apartheid South Africa. And I remember hearing him speak about how when he would go out in public, his white father would be on the other side of the street, and he and his mother would be on this side of the street, and they couldn't even pretend like they knew each other, because that would violate the law of this petty apartheid, and he couldn't even acknowledge his own father because Trevor Noah looks black, even though he had a white father, and so he couldn't acknowledge this white man as his father. Because that's the degree to which the races were separated. In 1960, there was a huge massacre. Essentially, there was a giant demonstration against apartheid and how it was wrong and evil and we should, integrate and all these things. And essentially, the police opened fire on the crowd and killed a whole bunch of people. And there's a picture there of the immediate aftermath of this massacre, where just these demonstrators had a mass volley of guns fired at them, and many, as you can see from the picture, died from it. Officially, legally, apartheid was over by the early 1990s. But like the United States, South Africa still faces a lot of kind of racial discrimination and de facto segregation, even if it's not segregation required by law. So, this is a really interesting and tough question. What makes people racist? Why do people think my skin color is better than other skin colors? What makes us think that this relatively minor physical difference is a symbol of this separateness, okay? And there's essentially three schools of thought as to why people become racist. The first is biological. There are some people's brains who are just more susceptible to fear of the other, fear of the outsider, right? And this does make a certain kind of biological sense, because evolutionarily we have evolved in some ways to be kind of fearful of the unknown, right? Ancient, long pre-civilization humans, if we were sitting in a place and there was something strange going on, the ones who were afraid of that and fled were much more likely to live than the ones who were like, oh, that's something strange, I should go investigate. So there is evolutionarily a reason to be afraid of the unknown, afraid of the outsider, afraid of the new thing. But obviously this is that survival response applied in a way and to a thing that it didn't evolve to apply to, okay? We're not supposed to be afraid of humans with other skin color. We're supposed to be afraid of, the sound of a tiger approaching in the jungle. But there is an argument to be made that there is at least a biological component. It's this fear center of the brain that gets kind of misused to fear people of other races instead of fearing the things that it was kind of evolved to fear. The second school of thought is the psychological school of thought, which essentially says that racism is kind of a learned reaction, right? We see our parents being racist, and so we're going to grow up to be racist. We see, um, an event happens in our young life. Maybe, we're 7 years old, and the school bully picks on us and harasses us, and he's of another race. So that event kind of shapes our psyche and makes us, or makes racists racist, right? It's a reaction to stimuli, whether that's teaching from our elders or incidents from our childhood or early adulthood. But essentially it's that kind of classical or operant conditioning. Third school of thought, the sociological, kind of says, yeah, the psychological is kind of right, but we also have to add in the social and historical context of the time, right? So let's not just look at that individual's reactions, but also look at the social context of the time. What's the media doing? What's the overall society doing? What's the, what historical events have happened during that person's life that the person kind of, saw in the newspaper or on TV or whatever. There's also, so late 1800s. I'll say it was 1898, but I could be wrong on this. Don't take my word for that one. Charles Darwin comes out with The Origin of Species. Now, this explained his ideas on evolution, which has been scientifically verified a gazillion times and is now accepted science. But at least in the first few decades after Darwin came out with these ideas, other groups kind of used his ideas in a perverted, twisted kind of way to justify racism. So early anthropologists made posters kind of, like these above, where it showed it. So essentially, Darwin's ideas were perverted to support the idea that there are sub-races of human, indicated usually by skin color, some of which are more evolved and some of which are less evolved, right? And so this poster kind of shows that, there's monkeys, then assorted types of Africans, then Native Americans, then Asians, then white people at the top, right? They're the most evolved, obviously, because they're the ones with the most civilization. Complete nonsense, of course, but a lot of people believe that, and a lot of people still believe this. But it was a really popular theory and popular science in the early 20th century. And then there have been two kind of sociological or philosophical ideas or theories about why societies as a whole become more or less racist over time. First guy, this guy named Rex, he says, look, in order to get racism you need these three things. One, you need a plural society, i.e. multiple different kinds of people, with an uneven distribution of resources, i.e. we have rich and we have poor. Two, we need identifiable boundaries. So in the United States and South Africa, that boundary is skin color. And then three, you need a culture that presumes the difference amounts to superiority. So because white people and black people are different, one has obviously got to be superior. The white people have essentially better guns. Thus, white people are obviously superior to black people. That's kind of the evolution of how society becomes racist, according to this guy. Second guy says, very similar, but slightly different. He says, look, you need these kind of conglomeration of three factors to come into play at once to get this institutionalized, overt, heavy-handed racism like you got in the American South and in South Africa. The first is a political or historical component, right? You need nationalism. You need, yay, we're our country, we're the best. The second is a cultural and religious society that approves of this separation. There's us, and then there's everybody else. And then third, you need the economic, i.e., resources. Okay. Now, applying these to South Africa. The first one, you absolutely got the nationalism because of the very brief history of South Africa. They get colonized by the Dutch. Then at some point, late 19th, early 20th century, there's a series of wars between Britain and the Boers, which is kind of the Dutch white South Africans. And those wars really upped the level of South African white nationalism. The cultural and religious things, these Dutch settlers or colonists were Calvinists, okay? And the Calvinists, at least back then, I don't know if they still do today, but one of the beliefs of that religion was that the descendants of Ham were designed to be slaves, essentially, okay? So for those of you who don't remember the Old Testament, Noah had children, and he got most of them onto the boat, but this guy, Ham, I can't remember exactly, rebelled against his father, did something bad, and God cursed Ham and his descendants. And this Calvinist belief that the descendants of Ham were supposed to be kind of subservient and serve the descendants of Noah, were the Calvinists kind of used that as an excuse to say, oh, the descendants of Ham are obviously the Africans, right? They look different, thus they must be different, thus they're probably from this story from the Bible, Ham and his descendants and all that. Oh, that's how we can tell that they're descendants of Ham, black skin. And so they started making this legal structure where race entered into everything, right? Everything from who you could talk to, who you could marry, what restaurants you went to, what doors of buildings you used. And because of that, it kept race in the minds of everybody at all times. So the people that were raised and lived in that society had race kind of at the forefront of their mind all the time. Because so many decisions that they had to make every day and so much of their daily lives revolved around what race they were, it kept this race thing in their mind at all times. And thus that helped to support this idea of separateness, of I'm this race, they're of another race, we're better and they're not, that kind of thing, okay? And then there's the economics of it. One of the big industries in South Africa is gold mining. And gold mining, especially back in the day, but even today, is really dirty work. Like, it is a horrible job. It is dirty, it's hot, sweaty, it's nasty. I mean, it's a really horrible job. Thus, there was a lot of money to be made by getting this people that they already, the Afrikaners, this group that they already looked down upon. It was economically advantageous to get them to do all these horrible jobs, right? And then land, farms. The white people got the land that they could make the good farms on. The black people got the land where they had they couldn't really grow much, right? So there was both the nationalism, the religious and cultural, and the economics that all combined in apartheid South Africa to create this incredibly racist system. Very similar things could be done with the American South, but I'm trying to keep these lectures not too long. I'm sure if you do some research into the political, economic, and religious and cultural history of Jim Crow laws in the American South, you will find mountains and mountains and mountains of great material. But I'm going to end our subsection here. I'll see you for the next.